A new study reveals millions of Americans are being left out of the nominating process when it comes to picking candidates in both major political parties, according to a report from the Unite America Institute, which researches and invests in nonpartisan election reforms. 23.5 million Americans will be locked out of the primary process because their states exclude independents from participating in Democratic or Republican primaries. The polarizing nature of America's partisan nominating system is the subject of the new book entitled The Primary Solution: Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. And its author, Executive Director of United America, Nick Troiano, joins us now. And Nick, thank you for joining us. In the book, you write in part, quote this: in competitive elections, we often see the impact of partisan primaries on candidates who run far to the left or right to get the party's nomination and then reinvent themselves for the general election to appeal to a broader audience. We've seen that. Yep. The less obvious but more pernicious impact of partisan primaries is how these same candidates, if elected, then govern. Members of Congress will act, speak, and vote in a way that is first and foremost necessary to keep their job, which nowadays means winning their next partisan primary. The problem is that what's required to win their primary often runs in the exact opposite direction of what is required to actually do their job, such as working across the aisle to solve problems. This is very real and is happening right now, as we're seeing. What's the solution?
Well, thanks for having me. You know, I've been working over the last decade researching and experimenting with ways to address the country's political polarization. And I wrote this book because I've developed a conviction that party primaries are the biggest solvable problem in our politics today. You know, it's not that they're the only problem. People talk about money in politics and gerrymandering. But if you look at which of these systemic problems we can actually do something about and which, if we were to solve, could make the biggest difference, I think addressing our broken system of primaries is the one that we should be focused on. And that's because the threat of being primaried is what determines the incentives of most of our elected officials and why we can't address issues ranging from foreign aid to immigration, as we're seeing play out in real time. And this problem is solvable. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment or act of Congress. Each state can reform their primaries by replacing them with nonpartisan primaries, and that's the solution that I write about in my book.
And certainly, amongst Republicans, we see them, we've had it publicly and privately, Republicans saying, I can't support this because I know I'll then get a challenge from the right. Some MAGA type will come after me. The book also, you write about how independents are locked out of the primary process. And we're seeing that sort of play out, I think, very vividly, and also in 2024, where we're in polling of independents, but also, frankly, some Republicans and Democrats suggest that everyone is just unhappy with this choice. So talk to us about why your solutions could help change that.
Well, I think that these solutions are about empowering a true majority of voters to be represented in government. You know, part of the dysfunction today is that 83% of our U.S. House seats are effectively determined in the primary because our districts are so lopsided. And in the midterms, only 8% of voters nationally cast ballots that determined those elections. So we have a small minority of voters electing the vast majority of our elected officials. If we can replace the party primary system with nonpartisan primaries, as Alaska did, for example, in 2020, a true majority can express themselves. And what we saw in Alaska was that voters elected a moderate Democrat to U.S. House, a moderate Republican to the Senate, and a conservative governor. So the system doesn't advantage one side or the other as much as it allows voters to make nuanced preferences as to who they want to represent them. And it impacts our Congress in a pretty significant way because our leaders are then liberated to represent their constituents, not just the small base of their party. And that's what keeps the system so gridlocked as it is today.
Nick, allow me to follow up on that very point, because we have some places that have tried nonpartisan primaries recently. You cite Alaska, where the results seem to kind of validate the thesis. Talk to me about California, where is the largest experiment, biggest state in the country, and a place where nonpartisan, my home state, a place where nonpartisan primaries have been implemented there. Is there anything like as clear a set of data that have come out of that state that where you kind of point to and say, Alaska, you're like, hey, look, it really works there. How's it working in California?
Well, there's no perfect electoral system. We have to compare every system to the status quo. And when you have the status quo being closed primaries that disenfranchise 24 million Americans, a system even like California's is an improvement over that. And our own research has found that since California adopted that system, it's been only one of 5 states that's actually depolarized since enactment. The 2 principles that I write about in the book that California has used and 5 other states that have abolished party primaries is that first, every voter should be able to vote for any candidate regardless of party in every taxpayer-funded election. And second, whoever wins these elections ought to have majority support. Right. And the states that have reformed their primaries, 5 of them so far, have followed those principles. And I think that's what more states should do, and many are following.
I'm just curious, though, when you say that there's evidence that California is depolarized, what does that mean? What's the thing you can point to and say, this is less polarized than it was before?
You can look at sort of the roll call votes of the state legislators, of the federal delegation, and there's more crossover voting that you've seen in other states, as well as just pressure on elected officials to have to represent a majority of their constituents, right? They're not just beholden to the 8% that determine these elections and primaries.
The new book is entitled The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. Author Nick Troiano, thank you very much for coming on the show, and congratulations on the book.